What happens when a royal family becomes so obsessed with its bloodline? Ferdinand I of Austria was born into one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, the mighty Habsburgs, but he was never meant to rule. His birth was no celebration. It was the tragic product of centuries of royal inbreeding. He had the crown. He had the titles. But behind the palace doors, Ferdinand couldn't walk properly, struggled to speak, and endured dozens of seizures every day. Some called him the Good, but it was a name whispered with a mix of pity and resignation. Today, few people even remember his name. His story is rarely told, tucked away in dusty archives, overshadowed by stronger kings and more dramatic rulers. But Ferdinand's reign was more than just a historical footnote. It was a warning. This isn't the tale of a conqueror or a tyrant. It's the haunting story of a forgotten emperor, broken from birth, ignored in life, and nearly responsible for the fall of an empire. On April 19, 1793, bells rang across Vienna to announce the birth of another Habsburg prince. Ferdinand Karl, Leopold, Joseph Franz Marcellin had arrived, and the imperial court rejoiced. He was the eldest son of Emperor Francis II and Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily. The dynasty had secured its future. But even in those first moments, behind the polished smiles of nobility, there were whispers. Something was off. Ferdinand was quiet, too quiet. His head seemed abnormally large and his limbs moved with stiffness. Over time, it became clear he wasn't developing like other children. His muscles were weak. His jaw protruded sharply, classic marker of the so-called Habsburg jaw. He drooled constantly and had trouble chewing and speaking. The doctors observed these signs carefully but said little. Publicly, he was declared healthy. Privately, the alarm bells had already begun. He suffered from hydrocephalus, a buildup of fluid in the brain. He experienced regular epileptic seizures, some so violent that he would fall unconscious. As he got older, the seizures worsened. He was prone to sudden, uncontrollable tremors and fits of blank staring. Often, he could not walk steadily or hold his utensils. His mental development was inconsistent. Bursts of understanding were followed by long periods of confusion. Today, he would likely be diagnosed with a combination of neurological disorders and developmental disabilities, possibly even a form of epilepsy-related cognitive delay. But in 19th century Austria, there were no such terms. There was only one thing that mattered: the preservation of royal blood. And that blood had become a prison. Ferdinand's deformities and illnesses weren't accidents. They were the end result of centuries of calculated inbreeding. Their marriage, like so many others in the Habsburg lineage, was arranged to consolidate power. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. It was a closed loop that had worked for generations, until it didn't. The Habsburgs had created a legacy of emperors and kings, but by the time Ferdinand was born, that legacy had turned against itself. He wasn't just a sick child, he was a genetic mirror held up to a decaying dynasty. Still, no one spoke of disqualification. No alternatives were discussed. From the moment of his birth, Ferdinand was marked as the future of the empire. To admit otherwise would mean exposing the cost of royal pride, and the empire wasn't ready for that kind of truth. So they pushed forward. They dressed him in gold and lace and told the public that their future emperor was intelligent, sensitive, and merely delicate. But the private letters of physicians and advisors told another story. Ferdinand couldn't concentrate, couldn't remember his lessons, and frequently had to be calmed like a toddler. His mind wandered, and when frustrated he would slam his fists against the table and shout nonsense. And he was still only a boy. By the time Ferdinand reached adolescence, it was clear to everyone in the palace he could never govern an empire on his own. He couldn't speak in full sentences. He couldn't retain information for more than a few minutes, and he couldn't be trusted to appear in public without careful supervision. But none of that stopped the Habsburg court. Instead, they doubled down. Ferdinand was placed in the care of a highly controlled educational team, led by Franz Maria Freiherr von Carnia Stefaneo, whose job wasn't to teach Ferdinand how to rule, it was to train him to appear as if he could. The lessons were repetitive, slow, and superficial. He was never taught complex political theory or military strategy. Instead, he was taught rituals, phrases, signatures. He practiced how to nod politely. He memorized brief lines for ceremonies. The goal wasn't understanding, it was performance. Behind closed doors, court life was built around Ferdinand's limitations. Staff avoided using long sentences around him. Meals were prepared soft because he couldn't chew properly. Ferdinand reportedly banged his fist on the table and blurted, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." The remark would become infamous. It summed up the quiet absurdity of a monarchy pretending its ruler was in command, while he was, in reality, a childlike figure who cared more about food than foreign policy. His seizures worsened with age. He often wore a padded helmet under his ceremonial hats to prevent injury. He would sometimes collapse mid-event, only to be carried out quickly while the court orchestra played louder to mask the chaos. And yet, no one in the inner circle dared suggest removing him. To admit that Ferdinand was unfit would mean questioning the divine legitimacy of the Habsburg crown. That wasn't just politically risky, it was unthinkable. Instead, a shadow government formed around him. His uncle Archduke Ludwig, the powerful statesman Clemens von Metternich, and several senior advisors created what they called the Geheim Staatskonferenz, the Secret State Conference. This unelected inner circle would rule in Ferdinand's name, issuing decrees and conducting diplomacy while the emperor signed off without comprehension. Ferdinand was emperor in title only, a ceremonial figurehead, a living illusion. Every now and then he would attempt to assert himself, with mixed results. In one instance, he insisted on joining a military parade but fainted from the heat before it began. At another event, he wandered away from his own entourage and had to be quietly redirected before embarrassing the court. Still, the public saw him only in tightly controlled glimpses. In paintings and engravings, he looked strong, dignified, imperial. No one saw the trembling hands, the glassy eyes, the quiet confusion, and that was exactly how the Habsburgs wanted it. In 1835, after the death of his father, Emperor Francis I, Ferdinand officially took the throne. He was just 42 years old, but mentally and physically he was far more fragile than anyone expected of an emperor. The coronation was grand, full of pomp and ceremony, but beneath the gold-threaded robes and booming cannon fire, a quiet reality was taking hold. Austria now had a ruler who could not rule. The empire, massive and diverse, was at a crossroads. From Bohemia to Galicia, from Hungary to northern Italy, tensions simmered. Nationalist movements were growing, liberal reformers were beginning to stir. But at the centre of it all was a man who often didn't understand what day it was. Ferdinand's first official act as emperor was to confirm the continuation of the Secret State Conference, the same shadow cabinet that had governed during his father's final years. Though technically now their sovereign, Ferdinand held no real power. The actual decisions came from his uncle Archduke Ludwig, his stepmother Empress Caroline Augusta, and most of all Metternich, Austria's master manipulator and the architect of post-Napoleonic Europe. Ferdinand signed what they placed in front of him. He nodded when told to. He appeared in public when necessary. And then he returned to his carefully managed world of comfort, repetition, and soft meals. To the outside world, the monarchy tried to maintain the illusion. Decrees were issued in his name. Paintings of Ferdinand showed him regal and composed. But even the foreign press began to speculate. Was the emperor really in charge? Or was Austria being ruled by committee? Inside the palace, the answer was clear. Ferdinand's daily schedule was arranged like that of a child. Strict mealtimes, routine walks, limited interactions. He was allowed to sketch, play games, and pet his dogs. The court described him as gentle and affectionate. But when pressed on political matters, he grew anxious, sometimes crying or shutting down completely. On paper, he was one of the most powerful men in Europe. In reality, he was an afterthought. Still, the dynasty refused to let go of the image. They posed him with military leaders, staged portraits with generals, and seated him prominently at official functions. The empire needed stability, and nothing screamed instability like an empty throne. But by holding on to a broken figurehead, they created a vacuum. Across the empire, liberal thinkers began to whisper that maybe the Habsburgs had lost their grip. Maybe the time of absolute monarchy was over. Ferdinand's existence didn't just raise doubts. It became a symbol, not of strength, but of decline. Even emperors without power were expected to follow tradition. And in the Habsburg world, that meant marriage, not for love, but for dynasty. Ferdinand, despite his visible limitations, was no exception. In 1831, 4 years before he officially took the throne, Ferdinand was married off to Princess Maria Anna of Savoy, the daughter of King Victor Emmanuel I of Sardinia. She was soft-spoken, pious, and 10 years older than Ferdinand. It wasn't a match made in heaven. It wasn't meant to be. It was, like everything else in his life, arranged for the sake of optics. The court spun it as a union of faith and tradition. The newspapers praised the dignity and devotion of the new empress. But behind palace doors, it was another performance. Ferdinand, uncomfortable and awkward, reportedly struggled to understand what was happening. He had no concept of what marriage was supposed to mean. On the wedding night, doctors were reportedly nearby, just in case something went wrong. That detail alone says everything. There were no children. Whether the marriage was ever consummated is unclear. Some letters from the time hint that Ferdinand didn't even understand the mechanics of intimacy. Others suggest Maria Anna quickly assumed the role of caretaker rather than wife. She accompanied him to ceremonies, stood beside him in portraits, but lived a largely separate emotional life. Her letters, when they survive, speak of duty, not affection. Still, she stayed. Maria Anna never abandoned Ferdinand, even after his abdication. For nearly 4 decades, she remained by his side, through seizures, episodes, and long stretches of silent decline. In Prague, where they eventually retired, she became his daily companion, nurse, and protector. The Habsburg court needed the marriage to signal strength. They needed the public to believe that the emperor could produce heirs, maintain appearances, fulfill expectations. But the truth was quietly devastating. The empire had forced a woman into a life of quiet suffering beside a man who could barely speak for himself. No one talked about her sacrifice. No one questioned the ethics. They simply labelled her the good empress and moved on, just as they did with Ferdinand. By the late 1840s, the illusion that held the Habsburg Empire together was beginning to collapse. Across Europe, revolution was in the air. In France, a king had been overthrown. In Italy, nationalist uprisings were gaining momentum. And in Vienna, the people were growing restless. Inside the Hofburg Palace, the signs were impossible to ignore. Prices were rising, food was scarce. Political pamphlets circulated through the streets, calling for reform, for liberty, for a constitution. And in the middle of it all sat Emperor Ferdinand, dazed, confused and powerless. He had no real understanding of what was happening around him. Reports say that during moments of national crisis, he would ask unrelated questions or become fixated on meals. While protesters clashed with soldiers just outside the palace gates, Ferdinand reportedly paced the hallways, unaware of the stakes. But the people were no longer willing to tolerate a silent monarch. In March 1848, revolution exploded in Vienna. Crowds stormed the streets, demanding an end to censorship, an end to absolutism, and the creation of a constitutional government. Universities shut down, workers organised, barricades went up. Metternich, the empire's true ruler for decades, was forced to flee in disguise. The shock was seismic. The man who had steered Austria through the post-Napoleonic era was gone, and the fragile figure left behind was Ferdinand. He was still technically emperor, but in name only. Desperate to calm the population, the government made a series of concessions: press freedoms, civil guards, the promise of a constitution. Ferdinand signed each one, likely without understanding what they meant. His hand was steady, but his mind was absent. Behind closed doors, the question could no longer be avoided. Could the empire survive with Ferdinand on the throne? The answer was increasingly clear: no. As revolution spread to Hungary, Bohemia, and northern Italy, the empire teetered on the edge of collapse. The military was stretched thin, the bureaucracy was paralysed, and the monarchy, already weakened by Ferdinand's condition, was rapidly losing credibility. In October of that same year, Vienna descended into open rebellion. The imperial family fled the city. Ferdinand was evacuated to Olmütz in Moravia under heavy guard. He had gone from emperor to political liability. The decision came swiftly. Ferdinand would abdicate. It was not framed as a punishment. There was no public scandal, no dramatic trial, just a quiet handover of power. In December 1848, Ferdinand signed the official document, relinquishing the throne in favour of his 18-year-old nephew, Franz Joseph. It's unclear whether he fully understood what he was giving up. According to a witness, Ferdinand said to his nephew, Franz Joseph, "God bless you, be good, it's my pleasure." Ferdinand's abdication in December 1848 marked the quiet end of one of Europe's most peculiar reigns. There were no riots in the streets, no national mourning. His departure was met with a strange silence, a reflection of how little he had actually ruled and how much had already changed without him. He was sent to Prague, where the imperial court arranged a residence at Hradčany Castle. It was not referred to as abdication, and Ferdinand retained the imperial title until his death. Officially, he remained a member of the imperial family. Unofficially, he was exiled, tucked away, out of sight, out of politics, and out of danger. But Ferdinand wasn't bitter. In fact, those who met him in Prague described him as calm, even cheerful. Stripped of responsibility, he seemed to breathe easier. There were no more documents to sign, no processions to attend, no shadow government using him as a mask. For the first time in his life, he was allowed to simply exist. He spent his days gardening, drawing, and attending religious services. He loved music and kept a small court orchestra. His seizures became less frequent with age, and his daily life followed a gentle, repetitive rhythm, one that suited him perfectly. And by his side through it all was Maria Anna, his devoted wife, who remained his constant companion until her death in 1884. Their bond, forged under obligation, became one of quiet comfort. They would walk the castle gardens together. He would hold her hand at Mass. She never spoke publicly about his condition, never complained, never left. Despite being removed from power, Ferdinand still held the title of emperor and was treated with formal respect. Letters from his nephew, Franz Joseph, often addressed him as His Majesty. When dignitaries visited Prague, they would sometimes be invited for short ceremonial audiences. These were carefully managed affairs, short conversations, polite nods, and lots of silence. In many ways, Ferdinand became a ghost of the old monarchy, a living symbol of everything the empire had tried to forget. But Prague loved him. Locals called him Ferdinand the Good, not because of anything he accomplished, but because of his kindness, his gentleness, and his harmless presence. He was remembered not as the emperor who failed, but as the man who had been thrust into a role he never wanted and carried it with quiet dignity. He lived another 27 years after stepping down, dying peacefully in 1875 at the age of 82, an extraordinary lifespan, especially given his early health problems. His funeral was modest but dignified. In death, as in life, he was remembered with a kind of restrained affection, a figure caught between tragedy and farce, between crown and cage.